Pop quiz. You're halfway through your project, and all your metrics look great. Your vendor spent the agreed number of hours, and your team's velocity and utilization are exactly where you plan for them to be. But in spite of your project having a clean bill of health, the product continues to miss the mark in focus groups and user testing. The technology your executive sponsor was adamant about is quickly becoming outmoded, making it difficult to make changes. And your team's morale is low. When you ask them for solutions, they shrug their shoulders and say they did what they were asked to do within the allotted amount of time. So how can your project be healthy, even if the output isn't producing its intended value? If you've been finding that your project metrics are measuring busyness more than value, keep listening. We're going to be diving into the practical mechanics of how project teams can measure value and exploring ideas for shifting the incentive from hours spent to value created. Hey folks, thanks for tuning in. My name is Galen Low with the Digital Project Manager. We are a community of digital professionals on a mission to help each other get skilled, get confident, and get connected so that we can amplify the value of project management in a digital world. If you want to hear more about that, head over to thedigitalprojectmanager.com. Alright, today we are talking about the difference between measuring project health and project progress versus measuring project success. So is it enough to track team velocity and cost performance, or is it our responsibility as project leaders to measure project outcomes and impact as well? With me today is Fred Fowler, a Level 3 certified Scrum Master who has published multiple books on the Scrum methodology, is the organizer of the Silicon Valley Professional Scrum Meetup group of about 2,000 members, leads a similar Scrum community based in Shanghai, China, and organized the first Silicon Valley Scrum-It conference. So in other words, someone who knows a thing or two about Scrum. Welcome, Fred.
Hello. Thanks for having me on the show with you.
Great to have you here.
I introduced myself as a scrummy guy. Although some people would say I'm scrumptious.
Well, that's better than me saying, Fred, scrum of the earth.
There are all kinds of ways you can play with the word scrum. You can scrum bag and whatever. Anyway, go ahead.
Indeed. Awesome. Well, listen, you've got such an interesting background, and I think it will give our listeners just a lot of context on just your take on project metrics. So if I understand correctly, you started as a computer programmer, and then you moved to politics, became a mayor, and then found yourself as a CIO before beginning to use your rare Level 3 Scrum Master certification to help others. So I was just wondering, could you tell us a bit about your journey and how your experiences have shaped the way that you look at things today?
Well, I would say my career resembled being inside a pinball machine. Started out as a programmer back in 1980, ancient times, working on a machine that was so big and heavy that it basically required special equipment to move it, and was less powerful than your average telephone today, your smartphone. But we ran a division of a semiconductor company using it, and I learned my skills there. Moved on. Of course, it was Silicon Valley in the early days, which meant there was lots of volatility. So in the first 8 years of my career, I worked for 5 different companies. And it was just incredible, like I say, volatility. And finally, at the end of that, says, I need some job security, so I better work for myself. And I became a consultant. And I worked for 60 different companies in the next 10 years. Again, doing the same stuff, always trying to apply technology to solve business problems, which is really what it's all about. And then there was a company I worked for as a consultant. They made me an offer I couldn't refuse. Ended up running their IT operation, ended up being, as I say, the CIO, and implemented a lot of techniques that really ended up being Scrum techniques, even though I didn't realize it at the time. Empowering people to solve problems, justifying the work based on the return on the investment. And back in those days, I did a lot of projects that really formed my whole outlook on how to organize endeavors. many things I'm proud of. The company had worked hard to build a website using a big 3-letter computer company everybody would recognize. And they paid $250,000 to that company to make a pretty pathetic e-commerce solution. And anyway, I got involved and I saw that there was great opportunity for improvement. So I organized a project, organized it along Scrum lines. And then we had, two different kind of technologies involved. There was a legacy, which is a IBM mini computer back then called the AS400. That was the back end, but we needed a front end. So what I did was I traveled to China and found a little company there who was ambitious and would do the front end. And so we organized in such a way that the US team did the back end work, the Chinese team did the front end work, and all we had to do was figure out how to get the two platforms to talk to each other. And that turned out to be pretty simple. So we replaced $250,000 piece of work with a website which within 6 months was doing 40% of the company's business and spent $14,000 doing it. $14,000. So, but it was simple. It was just, people who understood the technology, turn them loose, give them a problem to solve, let them solve it. Have teams different parts of the world. That's okay. All you have to do is manage the way they interface with each other.
There you go. Yeah, you lean teams, data contract, and off you go.
That's right. Right. And the thing that really, really was the key was to understand what was important to measure. When you're talking about offshore teams and everything, everybody freaks out. Well, how do we know what they're doing? So we want to have all kinds of tools to measure how hard they're working, how busy they are, because we want them to be busy, busy, busy all the time, right? Guess what? That doesn't matter. It makes no difference whether the people who are offshore are busy or not. That's not important. What is important is what they actually deliver, the value of what they deliver. That's what you should measure. Forget about trying to hold stopwatches on people. It doesn't matter. Here's an example. If you had a team of over 200 people working, 8-10-hour days for 2 years versus a team of maybe 5 or 6 people, 10 people working, regular hours for 1 year, who do you think would deliver the most value? Well, it turned out that the 200 people who worked for 2 years created what's called healthcare.gov, which is a website many years ago that turned out to be a total disaster. It was supposed to be something that would implement Obamacare. And it crashed and burned because those 200 people were being measured on how busy they were. And the 10 people over the next year were the ones who completely rewrote the thing and made it work. And, they delivered far more value than those 200 people otherwise.
I was gonna say, let's dive into that because I think it's a huge point. You touched on one of the reasons why we measure busyness, but in my world, like I come from an agency background and consultancies, and it's all about billable hours. It's about utilization. It's about how many bugs we squashed or how many tasks we completed. Like, why do we have this tendency to measure busyness?
Oh, it's simple. It's because it's easy to measure. All you need is a clock to measure how busy people are. All you need in order to figure out whether people are adhering to a bunch of deadlines is a calendar. It's easy to measure. And you know what? It's the basis of compensation. You mentioned billable hours. That's a great fallacy. The idea that people's time is valuable. Well, people's time is valuable to them, but what's valuable to you is what they do with that time. It'd be much, much better if the world had a good yardstick to measure what the results of people's time is. And actually, when I talk with companies, I try to tell them, what you need to do more than anything else is to figure out the value of what you want created and to be able to divide it into the pieces that make sense so that it's measurable, and then measure progress based on what the value created is. Within Lean, there's this idea of a minimum viable product. You do as much of a product as is necessary in order to get something into the hands of the customer. You know why that's a good idea? It's because that something has value, because it's in the hands of a customer. The customer can tell you how valuable it is. And that way, you can judge whether the value that was created was worth the expense you went to get it created. If you have an app that cost $500,000 to build, well, was that a good investment or not? Well, it depends. If the app goes up on iTunes and it downloads 3 million copies at $2 each, well, gee, you just made $6 million on a $500,000 investment. Hey, that's a pretty good deal. I'd do that any day. Same $500,000, put the app up on iTunes and it only does 20,000 downloads at $2. Well, let's make it 25,000. That means you spent 500,000 to create 50,000 worth of value. Same effort, same number of billable hours, but the value of the result is different, and the value of the result is what's important.
I think you touched on something really important there that I don't know if everybody fully appreciates about the minimum viable product. I'm going to circle all the way back to something you said earlier. We measure busyness because sometimes it's a trust thing. We don't trust that people are doing a thing, but if we can hold a clock to them while they work, then at least we know we're working those hours. But to your point, it doesn't measure value. And I think people will come to me and they'll say, well, I mean, of course we need billable hours. Like that's the contract. That's how people are getting compensated. That's the deal. But what I like about what you said about the minimum viable product is that, listen, let's get something out there. It's going to take an investment. And then as the customer, you can decide whether or not that's valuable. Which in a way, I mean, I guess some people might be like, well, I want to know that it's valuable before I spend the money. But in reality, that doesn't happen either, right? You're like, oh, I have $50,000. Okay, we're going to build the thing. And then after you spend that $50,000, you might still not have the thing that you wanted that's going to create value. But I feel like, billable hours and dollars, like a lot of people think, yeah, maybe it is. I mean, I don't know if do you feel like it's like a necessary evil for business to get done? Or is it something that we should be trying to creep beyond?
Okay. Well, in some ways it's a necessary evil, but you still have to keep people in the straight and narrow by comparing what their cost is to what the valuable result is. Now, here's something about the Scrum framework. Within Scrum, you always have to create something that's done, finished, complete, ready to give the customer at the end of every sprint, right? Now, why do you suppose that is? Why do you suppose it's important that something has to be done, ready, complete, and able to be given to a customer? Why do you suppose that is?
I'm going to hazard to say so that it's value that can be measured.
That's right. That's the only time something has value. It's when it's done, when it's ready to give to a customer. And by the way, that's how you measure value. You measure value by how much a customer will pay for it. So Scrum has this every 2 weeks, you create something of value so that you can measure that value and compare it to the cost of creating it. So you know ahead of time whether you're on track to create a $6 million product with a $50,000 or $500,000 investment, or a $50,000 product with a $500,000 investment. You need to be able to break it up into pieces that each have measurable value. Not, well, I think it's value. No, measurable value. You see, that's one thing that Scrum emphasizes. It emphasizes that you make decisions based on things you measure, not guesses, not opinions, things you measure. And the most important thing to measure is value.
I was wondering if you could walk us through that measurement of value, because in my notes here, I'm like, okay, so if measuring busyness isn't all that useful, then what are the metrics that we should be measuring as a team, right? As a sort of Scrum team in this scenario. But It strikes me that what you're saying is also kind of putting it, and not necessarily putting it, on a shelf and putting it into the marketplace, but who does that evaluation of whether or not something is valuable sprint over sprint? And how is that something that you track?
Okay. Well, first of all, it's a good idea to recognize that in the Scrum framework, the measurement of value really is only one person's job. You see, Scrum divides responsibilities into three pieces. There's the product owner, there are the developers, and then the Scrum Master. Now, the product owner's job is to maximize the value of the work of the team. Okay? The product owner is the one responsible for value. Now, you can't maximize something unless you can measure it. Because if you can't measure what you're trying to maximize, you have no idea whether what you're doing is making it better or worse. You have to be able to put a yardstick up against it. Now, there are 4 ways that you can increase value. The most common way is revenue. Again, make an app, sell 3 million copies of it for $2 each. You know the value. You can measure the value of that app, $6 million. Another way is by reducing the cost of something. If you make 1 million widgets a year and you reduce the cost by 50 cents, that's worth $500,000. Easy, no brainer, no yardstick really required. I mean, that's how that works. Okay. The third way is by reducing risk. Now, that's something I did when I was a CIO. I worked for that company. We were headquartered in a city south of San Jose, California, a little bit south of Silicon Valley. And we had a data center there, and we were connected to the outside world through a fiber cable that went up to the main office in San Jose, California. And we basically had our data center there, and we connected from there to all 22 North American locations. And pretty much we processed the orders in our headquarters and then sent out instructions to all the different warehouses. Please ship this here, please ship that there. And then once a year, some idiot with a backhoe between us and San Jose would dig up that fiber cable and break the connection and put us out of business for a day. And we usually did around $1 million a day. So what's the cost of that risk? Once a year, $1 million hit, $1 million a year. Yeah. So it made sense for me to propose that we move the data center. We take it out of our headquarters building and move it to a very secure location outside of Sacramento where Google and Facebook and all those folks have their servers. And this place was really interesting. It was run by the ex-nuclear officer of a submarine. And so but it was secure as anything. You had, retina recognition to get in the door. It had overpressure, so it would blow dust out rather than in. It had power coming in from 2 different substations, from 2 different electric grids. It had the biggest dang batteries I've ever seen. They were like truck trailer sized batteries. They had 6 of the biggest. Anyway, this thing was never going to go down. And so we moved it there and we spent $50K. Would you spend $50K to save $1 million? Hell yes.
You only got $50K to move your data center? That's great.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely I would.
Yeah. We just rented some of the racks, which is what it was. And they were locked, so we put our stuff in and lock it up, and then we just ran everything out of there. And they had superb connections. So anyway, so if you reduce risk, $1 million a year risk, cut it down, that's value, easy to value. Now, so that's 3. The 4th way to increase value is to increase opportunity. If you're in a bidding situation and you win 1 bid out of 6, and if you can then do something that makes it more likely you can win 2 bids out of 6, well, you can easily add up the money that's involved there. You can use that to compare against the cost of doing so to be able to make a decision. Well, yeah, this makes sense.
That's actually really interesting. So the product owner is responsible for value. They're measuring all this value. We're talking about these 4 levers to increase value. How are they then funneling that back down to the development team in this model?
Okay, well, first of all, there's 4 different levers, as you say, 4 different ways to create value. The product owner's job is to measure that and make rational decisions about what the team should work on. Now, it's important to realize you can't measure the value of something that doesn't exist. And by definition, the people who are creating the product doesn't exist until they create it. So in effect, the product owner has to guess as to what will be valuable. Okay, that's an investment decision. Just like buying stocks or anything like that, you take an educated guess as to what you think will be valuable, and then you direct the teams to create that value. And then they do, and then you put that into the hands of customers to find out how valuable it is. You check and you measure the value by finding out what people will pay for it, what you're actually saving in terms of cost. So you measure it after the fact. But based on that, you make investment decisions. And that's the key. It's investments. Now, how do you tell whether the product owner is doing a good job? Well, you look at the return on those investments. If you spend $50,000 on a sprint, do you get more than $50,000 worth of value out of it? Okay. Now, you could say, well, okay, if that's all the product owner's job and the developers don't really care about that, well, guess what? They should care, because how do you think they get paid? Why would somebody want to pay them $50,000 for a sprint and only get $25,000 of value out of it? So in many ways, the product owner and the team are all in the same boat. They've got to deliver more value than they're costing.
And that's like such a crisp statement there, because I think coming back to what we were saying originally, right? Like actually sometimes our mindset is, well, of course they're going to pay me. I did 80 hours of work and I said I'd do 80 hours of work and I did 80 hours. Like, why wouldn't they pay me? But actually that's like, we're caught in our own trap there, because it's not a conversation about value. It's about time for dollars, not necessarily value.
That's right. Right. And once you realize that, once developers realize that, they realize they have a vested interest in making sure that what they're doing is valuable. So in effect, you have a partnership going. The product owner isn't a technical role. Product owner is a business role. Product owner should identify, hey, this would be really cool and valuable if we created it. Now, the developers are the technicians. The product owner says what is desirable. The developers tell the product owner what is possible. And then through a negotiation, you figure out what's practical. What of the possible things we could do would be the most valuable ones. And that's what Scrum is all about. Scrum is about a negotiation between people who have responsibilities for those two different areas. And ideally, the product owner really understands the business. The developers really understand the technology. And so together they can say, okay, here's a business problem. We can apply this technology to it, and bam, we got it.
I like that word you use, partnership, because I don't know if a lot of people see it that way at first, right? They're like, okay, whatever the product owner decides, that's what we're going to do, and we'll just do it. And it still feels like this servitude, but actually it's not. The thing you said at the beginning, that Scrum is about empowerment. It's about empowering individuals and their expertise. And I love that word, negotiate, to negotiate that balance between, business value, everything that we want, versus what is feasible, to get to that practicality of a product that will deliver value, again, without costing an arm and a leg, right? Because that's still part of value as well.
Oh, yes, indeed. Yeah. And developers can have a lot of influence about how much things cost. And in some perhaps non-intuitive ways. So for instance, let's say they're developing some kind of an app which contains your personal information, so it has to have some kind of a way to identify yourself. The product owner might say, okay, well, let's create a login function, with a screen and a password and an ID and all the stuff that goes along with it, like setting the password, changing the password if you get it, all that stuff. And so the product owner might say, okay, please create a login screen with all this stuff. And the developers might say, okay, let's go create another login screen with all this stuff. What the developers should say is, well, have you thought about using something like sign in with Google, sign in with Facebook? Because they've done all that work for us. All we have to do is hook up to that, and we can deliver that need without having to do anything much. Isn't that a good idea? So the developers, a lot of developers say, just tell me what you want me to do, and I'll do it. Just tell me what you want me to do. Oh, you want me to reinvent the wheel? Okay, fine, I'll reinvent the wheel. And I'm getting paid by the hour, so why not? What you should ask developers is, can you solve this problem? The product owner's problem is that he needs users to identify themselves uniquely to this app so they can get at their private data. So the problem is, how can this app identify its users? Okay, developers, how can we do that? And the developers say, oh, well, can you sign in with Google? Hey, phones these days have facial recognition stuff. We can hook into that. There are fingerprint readers. There are lots of ways we can do it without having to reinvent the same old, tired old login system. So we can tell you what is easy and hard. You can tell us what is valuable or not so valuable. So the negotiation is, well, let's figure out the easiest thing we can do that is valuable. And then that's the plan. Do that. And just make sure you do it in such a way that you can create it in a piece that can be given to a customer so you can measure what the value is.
I'm wondering because I've definitely been guilty of measuring busyness or even speed, right? Like velocity is still a thing. We'll measure that. We'll have our burn down charts. But what does the conversation look like in some of the teams you've worked with, the Scrum teams, about value? Does the product owner come back and say, listen, we wanted this to be worth $65, but turns out people only want to pay $60 for it? Or how does that come back to the team? And are they thinking about, like, okay, let's optimize, let's maximize that value by moving the needle on this metric? Is that kind of how it comes down to it? Or is it more just kind of like shifting the direction sprint over sprint rather than going, okay, well, the earned value of the thing that we've built so far is only this much and we need to make it more than that?
It kind of comes down to compensation, which you alluded to earlier. If everybody's getting paid by the hour, well, then everybody's incentive is to, do everything the hard way. Do it. And by the way, that's a disease that's inflicting a lot of projects. I mean, I work with a company, a Fortune 50 company, who you instantly recognize if I told you the name. They had a very ambitious project, 2 years, $500 million to completely re-platform all of their business processes. Yeah, and they had an army of people in there, and they were busy as hell. There were meetings. There were all kinds of, reports. They were people writing code. And by the way, that's where I first learned the term throwaway code. What? What's throwaway code? It's, oh, well, we thought we needed this and we wrote it up, but it turns out we didn't need it after all. And anyway, these guys were just churning and busy. The whole place was just a hive of activity. And after 2 years, they called me in because after 2 years and most of that 500 million, they had created no value at all. They had just created a lot of noise and a lot of activity and spent a whole lot of billable hours running around and, basically doing busy work. They didn't know it was busy work at the time, but it turned out to be because there was simply no result that made any value. So there are plenty of horror stories about that. But let's talk about compensation though, because I've actually been thinking about this and saying, what would be the right way to do it? And there are really two aspects of compensation. There's the first piece of it is getting people in the door, getting talented people in. And in order to do that, you kind of have to pay market rate. So, an average junior coder is worth a lot less than your average senior, whatever specialist. And the market reflects that. So in one level, you have to, pay according to that. So that's kind of like getting somebody in the door. Now, at the other hand, how do you compensate for the value that people produce? Well, what you have to do is you have to give them part of that value as a reward. So if a team creates, let's say they create $100,000 worth of value, okay? Well, the company needs to, pay for its infrastructure and stuff like that. So maybe they give 20% of that to the team. So they get $20,000. Now, how do they divide it up? Do they divide it up according to who has the highest salary? Well, that kind of wouldn't be fair, would it? Because it could be that junior programmer who's not worth a whole lot of billable hourly rate might have really saved the day. So the right thing to do is to give that 20 grand to the team and let them figure out who should get what part of it. And that way, they all have an incentive to create a lot of value, and nobody knows better than them who deserves the reward. So let them figure out how to divide up that value in a fair way.
It's funny because, it's similar to like a profit sharing model, right? Right, where it's like, okay, here are the results from the quarter, and then we're bonusing people out, and managers get to figure out that distribution, or in some cases, maybe a team figures out that distribution. But it's actually really interesting in terms of what you're saying is like base salary, get people in the door, plus incentive based on the value that is created, and measured with some level of consistency by the product owners. That's very interesting.
This makes sense because it gets all the incentives in the right way. Now, that's one great thing about the Scrum framework. It gets everybody's incentives right. And it gets decision-making put into the hands of the people who are capable of making those decisions and capable for being accountable for them. So the product owner is basically an investor. Fine. Give the product owner the ability, the authority to invest the team's time however the product owner sees fit. But measure the results of those investments to see whether the product owner is doing a good job or not. And the product owner ought to be the person who makes decisions about, okay, let's do this and not do that, but then be answerable for what the results of those decisions were. Likewise, the development team. The development team has full authority to figure out how they're going to do this. Nobody should tell them what to do. By the way, developers hate that. They really want somebody just to tell me what to do, and I'll do my best. Because then they can just do whatever they're told and then go home and have a life and then come back and do more. But if they have somebody else tell them what to do, then they really can point fingers if anything goes wrong. Oh, you gave me something that was too hard for me to do. Well, that wasn't my fault. That was your fault. You gave it to me. You should have known better. So it's not my problem. It's your problem. You're to blame. By having the developers have the authority to make all those decisions themselves, they have nobody to point any fingers at except themselves.
And I mean, we haven't done, our industry has not done a good job of fostering accountability because some of the behaviors have been that. Do it this way because I told you so.
That's right. And and that's so counterproductive because it means that all the lessons that are learned while you're doing it don't impact the people who are making the decisions. That's why Scrum says that development teams have to be self-managing and they have to be cross-functional. Cross-functional means they have to be able to create the product all by themselves. If they aren't, if they can't, then they say, oh, well, we did our part, but they didn't do their part, so it's their fault. And of course, everybody is pointing fingers every which way. No, they have to be able to do it themselves, so there's no fingers they can point at anybody else. Second of all, they have to be able to organize and manage themselves. They have to make their own decisions because if they don't make their own decisions, they can always blame problems on whoever did make the decisions. And by the way, whoever did make decisions didn't learn from the problems and mistakes that were encountered doing that. There's an old saying that says, nothing is impossible if you don't have to do it yourself. So if somebody tells you to do something, well, it's not impossible to them because they don't have to do it themselves. It's up to you to try to do. And how many times have you ever been asked to do the impossible? I know I have been asked to do the impossible many times.
That's actually funny. It's interesting, right? Because it's that balance of empowerment and accountability, like together, right? You can empower them, but you're gonna be the team's gonna be accountable, and that's a journey. That doesn't happen overnight.
That's true. But it's three things that balance: empowerment, accountability, but capability. The people who are empowered have to be capable of doing it. A product owner has to be capable of shouldering the responsibility of investing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to try to create valuable products. The developers have to be capable of creating the product by working as a team in order to be accountable for doing so, and then therefore have the authority to do it. And that's the Scrum Master's biggest challenge always. The Scrum Master's job is to get everybody working together as a team and understand their own responsibilities. Usually the Scrum Master has to try to beat some sense into developers' heads who just want to be told what to do and just say, okay, we'll do our best. And by the way, one good way to help is by introducing a compensation scheme which rewards them for the actual value they create. Because once they realize, if we don't do a good job, we're not going to get any bonus. And the way that we get a bonus is by the measurable value that's created. Oh, okay. Well, let's get our act together.
I like that. Measure value and reward value.
Yeah. By the way, let me make one more point. It's very important for the product that a product owner is working on to have a measurable value. If you're working on something, but you can't measure its value, it's not a product, and you can't make any rational decisions about how to do it. Let me give you an example. I worked for a company that had basically it's a web-based application for financial transactions. And they had three big components. They had, the front end, which was the website and some app engine and things like that. Then they had a middle part, which were APIs, the front end talked to, and then there was the back end that actually did the processing. Okay, so three different levels, three different layers. When I got there, the company had three different product owners, one for each level. And there was constant bickering because the front end people, they wanted, these new capabilities, but they had to argue with the API product owner to get the API product owner to prioritize that. And then they had to argue with the back-end product owner to prioritize that. And there were all these pissing contests going on. There was actually one pissing contest where a crucial update for the front end was held up for 2 years because the back-end product owner didn't find that doing that would be within his compensation plan. So he had no interest in doing that. But the thing is that there weren't any products. I mean, you couldn't measure the value of the front end without considering the value chain of the front end, the middle, and the back end. You couldn't measure the value of the back end without considering. So there should have been just one product owner for the whole value chain who would be accountable for the value delivered by the whole thing. And that way, all of the conflicts would go away, and you'd actually have a rational development situation.
So it's actually funny that the inhibitor of value is sometimes just politics, right?
Well, yeah, oh yeah. Well, I mean, different people with different, and the key is no one could measure the value of what they were doing. No one could measure the value of the decisions they were making. So they were random. They had no way of rationally making decisions about what the development team should work on.
Yeah, we have this notion of like the minimum viable experience as well, right? Like you said, it's 3 layers, but if you have to cut it in slices, top to bottom, not horizontally, because otherwise you're only seeing one layer. And what you're saying, if I'm picking up what you're putting down, what you're saying is that there's probably teams out there who are like, yeah, we can't do Scrum. We don't really produce increments. We don't really have the notion of minimum viable product. But actually, they might just not be orienting themselves around a product mindset, which would be to think of it as these slices, not as these component parts that get managed separately and have different priorities and different backlogs and different product owners. It's very interesting. It's very cool.
Actually, I checked this out with Jeff Sutherland, by the way. He's the guy who helped create Scrum. And basically, he confirmed that a product is something that can be produced and that has an objectively measurable value. In other words, you can understand the value objectively without some opinion coloring all up. Now, how do you measure the value of a product? Well, I told you the 4 ways it can increase, but you measure the product by selling it. You measure the product by getting somebody to pay for it. And so, if you can't sell something, you can't get somebody to pay for it, you don't have a product. You've got a part of some other product, which is the real product, which should govern the decisions about how it should be developed.
I want to round out with one last question. We've been talking a lot about Scrum, and I know you're a huge proponent of Scrum, but when it comes to measuring value and impact over busyness, can this work for other methodologies, and what advice would you give those people?
Other methodologies. Well, yeah. And you know what? Scrum is kind of a layer on top of something deeper. Agile is kind of a layer on top of something deeper. And Scrum is kind of, it's ironic because Scrum is all about trying to make products without trying to follow a recipe. The PMI waterfall model is all about planning, and creating a recipe for some group of people to follow step by step to end up with the result. The trouble is that doesn't work very well because things change. One of my favorite anecdotes is by a guy named Roman Pilcher who wrote a book a long time ago, but it was a very good book, Agile Product Management with Scrum. He was one of the first product owners who actually wrote about it all. He talked about his experience running a 2-year project for a medical services company to completely re-platform their main product. In other words, they were going to bring their main product up to date. And so they planned it carefully. They did it good old waterfall model. This guy managed 9 separate paths, brought it all in on time, under budget 2 years after the initiation of the project, only to find out that the product was already obsolete before they delivered it. Yeah. So basically things change. And what Scrum, following a recipe is no good. That Scrum says, don't do that. Do increments, watch what you're doing, learn. But the trouble is the Scrum guide is nothing but a cookbook. It's a recipe for trying to do a project. But the deeper truth underneath that and underneath all the other things is that you have to be able to have qualified people make decisions that they are accountable for, both in the terms of business and in the terms of product development. And the developers have to be able to, create the thing and manage themselves. You have those two things plus some way of measuring incremental product progress. And that's the basis of Scrum. That's the basis of Kanban. That's the basis of all of it. So what I would encourage everybody, no matter what form they're using, make sure that you focus on measuring value as opposed to activity. Measure results as opposed to outputs. And if you do that, then I don't care what framework you're using, as long as you are able to do things, measure the results, and learn from them. That's the road to success.
There you have it, folks. There it is. Very cool. Fred, we were talking about your meetup group. We were talking about the books you've written. Where can folks listening learn more about those two things?
Yeah, I've been running a meetup group since 2015, all about Scrum. We call it the Advanced Scrum Case Studies Meetup. So once every 2 weeks, we get together online and I post a case ahead of time, which usually provides some or poses some problem in terms of project management, Scrum management, some difficulty, like, for instance, how to deal with offshore, onshore teams, how to measure value, which we've been talking about a lot. So we meet once every 2 weeks. If you're interested, you're free to join. You can find, it's called the Silicon Valley Professional Scrum Meetup Group. You can search for that on Meetup, and then you'll see the Advanced Scrum Case Studies Meetup we have. I'd love to have you. By the way, that meetup has produced a lot of interesting material. I've gotten notes from about 60 different cases, all very interesting, some submitted by me, some submitted by some of the members. And I've written them all up in a volume called Advanced Scrum Case Studies. It's available on Amazon. You can also buy it on my website, which is www.siliconvalleyscrum.com. It's got 15 of the very interesting cases, and I'm actually working on volume 2 right now, so it'll be another 15. Like I say, I've got more than 60 cases stockpiled, and I'm getting more every couple of weeks, so I'm going to be documenting them in that way.
That's super cool. I didn't realize the book was based on the material from the discussions in the meetup group. That's so cool. I love that.
Fred, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really enjoyed your stories. I really enjoyed your perspective. I loved our conversation on compensation. I think that's a whole nother episode in and of itself. But I hope all of our listeners got a lot of great value from that. Thank you.
Thanks. I really enjoyed talking with you. Thanks for having me.
So what do you think? Is it feasible for project teams to orient around value creation instead of hours billed or user stories completed? Or are we too deeply dependent on a money for labor hours model? Tell us a story. What have been the right metrics to track for your projects? And what kind of changes or results have you seen from having insight into your project data? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to hone your skills as a strategic project leader, come and join our collective. Head over to thedigitalprojectmanager.com/membership to get access to a supportive community that shares knowledge, solves complex challenges, and shapes the future of our craft together. From robust templates and monthly training sessions that save you time and energy, to the peer support offered through our Slack discussions, live events, and mastermind groups, being a member of our community means having over 1,000 people in your corner as you navigate your career in digital project delivery. And if you like what you heard today, please subscribe and stay in touch on thedigitalprojectmanager.com. Until next time, thanks for listening.